I have indexed a lot and I've had lots of conversations with CTOs in various organizations that I'm probably over indexed in is AI is an extinction event. And I think that's not just for roles like developers, et cetera, but for organizations. And so I've seen a lot of companies I've talked to that are like, and customers, right, are like, yeah, we're kind of dipping our toe, but we think we've got, plenty of runway ahead of us. We don't need to be thinking, transformationally in terms of generative. And I think I've raised a lot of eyebrows on that statement where this is an extinction event.
Welcome to Tech Teams Today, where we talk with the people building and leading the engineering orgs behind today's most innovative companies. Today's guest is Derek Knudsen, Head of Engineering and Chief Delivery Officer at Revenue.io. You are going to learn why he thinks AI is an extinction-level event. You're going to learn about the importance of running very thorough hiring processes and making surgical hires. And you're going to learn what to do when you receive 7,000 applications for a front-end position. Before we dive in, if you wouldn't mind, just do me a quick favor. Hit like and subscribe. It really helps make sure that other engineering leaders find this episode, and it will make sure that you don't miss any future ones. Let's dive in.
Derek, thanks for being on the show. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, excited to be here. Excited to chat with you, Lucas.
Awesome. Let's start understanding a little bit better your team. How is it structured right now?
We're very remote, going like most folks coming out of COVID. Our office is in LA. It has been in LA since the inception of the business about 11 or 12 years ago. But with COVID, everybody went remote, including the folks that lived in LA, and we still are in LA. So, geographic distribution is remote, but our teams are kind of small and mighty. We've got just a handful of teams, and some of them are larger teams. We've kind of ebbed and flowed between being more kind of feature centric and then being more product centric. Right now, we're kind of more product centric and than we have been in the past.
Okay, and you spoke a little bit about COVID. We speak to a bunch of tech leaders who also have gone through that change of going remote during COVID, but they also report other changes taking place more recently as the world got used to working remotely, but COVID's gone. Have you seen changes in the past 18 to 24 months to that effect?
I would say with the remote side of it, no. I mean, obviously, there's my sister works at Amazon, and so she's had to suffer through the Amazon ebb and flow, the Google, the CL, I would say in general, kind of call back to business that now seems to be everywhere. I think there's a lot more demand for local. Talking to other CTOs, you see a lot more pullback into being a local office, a much higher propensity to hire locally. But we've stayed with the remote mentality, and we come together, probably like a lot of folks when you need to do ideation or more strategic conversations that are more challenged over a digital medium. That's kind of to call the arms to go back to the office and meet for those important meetings. But we've gotten to be pretty successful with the remote piece of it. But like everybody else, there's definitely a lot more noise towards in person than there historically has been, at least, since COVID, for sure.
Yeah, and you spoke a little bit about, you mentioned that the teams are small and mighty. Tell me a little bit more about that. What's behind that decision of making squads smaller?
Well, I think, COVID was a forcing function, I think, for everybody. And then, we're a pre-IPO company. And I think like a lot of companies, you look at the capital markets, and venture capital is not an easy thing, hasn't been an easy thing to find. And so I think it made you get really capital efficient. I think one thing this company's done a great job, nothing really to do with me, is highly capital efficient. And so we make really intelligent decisions on resourcing, where I think in a world of abundance, I think the guardrails on decision making for hiring can get a little blurred, and it's just, let's just hire people and let's throw bodies at problems versus let's be more exacting the types of bodies we're throwing at problems. And so over the last 2 or 3 years, we've gotten really surgical on our team and the size of the team and the constructs of the team. And it's actually, we haven't lost any velocity by like reducing our team size and then being a little more exacting. Our velocity has actually not decreased at all. In fact, it probably has increased because there's less impediment at cognitive switching with lesser folks that are more familiar with each other's working habits. Like that's become more efficient for us. So we're really surgical about hiring. We don't tend to hire a lot unless there's a huge need, because we are able to accomplish a lot with just the team that we do have.
Excellent. You you mentioned that you guys used to be, correct me if I'm wrong, but you said you used to be feature focused in the structure and now you're product focused. Maybe I'm confusing things there, but we see a lot of discussion around that. You have companies that use some squads that are client facing, some teams that are platform focused. How do you think about that sort of issue?
Well, when I was so before I was here, I was at Alteryx, which is a large analytics company. When I was there, we had 500 engineers, so it's a much bigger problem in terms of the organizational kind of structure of it. And so that's right when the team topology stuff came out, and so for our new architecture teams, we did index towards that mindset, and it had a lot of success. But we were building a brand new SaaS platform from scratch. We were mostly on-premise software, and we were transitioning to the cloud. We had a lot of dollars to make large investment from a resourcing and I guess any resourcing perspective in terms of software and people, et cetera. And so we did follow that construct, and I think it worked well. It was an emerging construct, but much like microservices, like everything its own repo and be distributed, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that happens when everything is distributed. Like if you think of doing a pull request across 17 repos to submit one PR, that's a lot of friction. And so same if you've got to work with all these little micro groups and try and accomplish a common outcome, it creates a lot of challenge. And so I think we kind of took it from, hey, we've got these feature oriented focuses to being much more platform oriented, because a lot of the work we do is cross platform, right? You're crossing product boundaries to accomplish a user journey, and so having to hand that off to team, you lose stuff in that handoff, and you get these real disconnected user journeys. And so that's why we've combined them back together. And so we'll dedicate parts of a team to focusing on a specific feature, but they execute that feature across the platform. They're not like, well, I did my part, now I'm going to hand it to this other product team to pick it up. It's they own it end to end.
Right. And also there's the fluidity of the teams themselves, right? At some point you might need to move people across teams. And if they're structured in a very siloed way, the amount of time it takes for you to ramp up that person who just entered a new team is just exponentially larger if you have these siloed teams.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that's one thing that has been a challenge for us a bit is we do have, when we had a lot of teams, we had a lot of, it's like if you build, what's the Conway's, law, if you have a two-pass compiler, you're going to build, two teams working on the compiler, each going to build a different compiler or whatever that analogy is. We have a lot of infrastructure. It was built by teams that had a desire to own their own piece of, the infrastructure. So when you combine everything and everybody's coming together, you've got a lot of architectural landscape to learn. And so I do think it's hard. It's hard coming to this organization, and especially on the back end and being a back end engineer, because there's 10, 12, 15 different services that construe our backend platform, and having to know how all those work is not an insignificant challenge. So we definitely gear towards hiring really experienced engineers. We can't hire junior engineers. It's just too much of a headwind in terms of getting them from zero to productive because of the complexity of the technical landscape.
Got it. And you mentioned the word surgical a few times there. I imagine that informs or like that basically defines your recruiting process, your interview process, right? That's how you really have to think about that. Tell us a little bit more about that. How have you adapted your hiring process to make it more surgical?
Well, I think one dimension that we've been really focused on, and it probably skews to just the push on the generative side, is we've been much more like if you look at a job posting for a company, you'll see we're much more focused on the attributes of the individual. Meaning, most JDs have what you've done, what skills you have is kind of the focus of it. We have a focus in ours, which is much more who you are, and so we have declarative statements on how you show up. That's part of our job description, and we index hard at hiring behavior. Because there's certain, I think if you look at the success in organizations in general, the folks who are successful, they align really well to whether it's formal or informal mission, vision, values. They align really hard to what's deemed valuable at the organization. And so you can hire all the experience and skills you want, but if the style of working isn't aligned to the folks that are most successful at an organization, then it doesn't matter what you bring to the table. You're gonna have friction. So we indexed really hard towards our screening process being really focused on behavioral attribute, behavioral traits, versus tell me, how to solve this technical problem, or use this co-piloting tool and, do a pairing exercise with me. That stuff comes, but if you can't pass the behavioral side of it, I don't care what else you bring to the table, it's not going to work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know the hard skills are really a must have. The behavior is really what makes winning teams. Um, and and how does that reconcile? How do you reconcile that with what you're seeing in the hiring market right now? Tell me your perspectives on what you're seeing in terms of volume of candidates, quality of candidates, maybe even, I don't know, fake resumes, AI avatars in interviews, that kind of stuff.
It's a timely topic. So we're not a huge company, we're not a big brand. I think we had a full stack role we posted, and we'd add from being, more specialized skills front and back end to being more T-shaped recruiting full stack. I think with the generative movement, it becomes easier to contribute outside of areas of your kind of core competency. So we posted a full stack role. I think for a company our size, I think traditionally, if you rewind, I don't know, 2 years ago, we maybe would get 500 applicants, right, for the role. With the last full stack role, we got 7,000. So it's become a real challenge to signal the noise in that resume pool, because you get a lot of automatic resume submissions, automatic application submissions. And I actually posted this into a CTO Slack community that I'm part of. Like we had multiple attempts at employment fraud, and we got pretty far down the path with a specific candidate who was obviously committing employment fraud that we discovered late in the process. And I'm happy to delve into that topic because it's fascinating. And I think I said, oh my gosh, it's like, that'll never happen to me. And then it happens to you. You're like, oh my God, like that's a real thing. I posted it in the Slack channel with all these very experienced CTOs, and the stories just started falling out of all these crazy scenarios with people, getting employment fraud happening. So the hiring landscape is really challenging. Obviously the employment market is rich for application. And then you've got all these technologies and fraudulent actors trying to engage in that as well. And it's become really difficult to find good talent, especially the technical side. I think if you're in a human to human role, like a sales role or something, you're not seeing as much, but in an engineering role, it's much more easy to be fraudulent in that hiring process. And we definitely have had multiple attempts at kind of inundating themselves into our organization that we've had to avoid.
Well, even by the nature of the tools that are used to defraud the system themselves, right? They are technical tools and therefore more accessible to developers and other tech related professionals. So, and I feel that in a sense, AI has been weaponized by both sides of the interview process, right? So on one side, you have candidates creating that sort of artificial inundation of volume, right, or creating an artificial volume there. And the other side, you have to develop the tools to screen for that because you can't do it manually. So yeah, it's escalating quite quickly, right?
Yeah, it's bad. I mean, the last one we got into was somebody who obviously had their identity stolen. And somebody tried to play the role of that person in hiring into our organization. And so you do background checks, you do stuff, and then you start sniffing around reference checks, and it's not really adding up. You're doing employment verifications with like pay stubs, and the pay stubs are there, but you don't look right. And then you begin to use these generative tools. Like I submitted a pay stub submitted at the last mile of the process because something didn't smell right into ChatGPT. And I said, this is supposedly from Gusto. Like evaluate this pay stub and tell me, the probability of it being fraudulent. And it did an amazing job of calling out all the areas where it had obviously been doctored and was a fraudulent pay stub. So yeah, I mean, you have to arm yourself with the tooling to battle the candidates. It's unfortunate. I mean, but it's the reality of the world that we live in. And then yeah, it's deep. And I saw a bunch of videos on deep fakes and people interviewing deep fakes, and it's nuts, man. It's a very difficult world, and we've got a client who's in the hiring space in terms of background checks and the stories that their business leader tells us in terms of state institutions trying to have corporate espionage attacks is real. So. And we're just a tiny little player in that. So if they're targeting companies like us, it's I'm sure they're targeting more IP rich companies than ours.
Yeah, and I think what that means for me is that trust is a scarce resource, right? Trust is you can find technical skills, you can find candidates, you can find applications, but trust is really scarce. You just a detail there, Derek. You mentioned that the references didn't add up and the pay stubs looked fishy. So this is pretty late in the interviewing process that you caught this, right? So this must have cost you quite a lot, right? Because if you can filter that at the top of the funnel, it's quite. I mean, you can do that algorithmically, but if you have to, if it's the human touch that's needed to sniff that out, that's really expensive, no?
Yeah, you would think, with some of those folks, they kind of suss out naturally during the tech process, and this person, whoever this person actually was we put them through the ringer and they passed every test. And you're looking at, these AI, you're looking at AI, co-piloting, and are their eyes drifting and are they reading stuff? There's all sorts of technologies I'm sure you're aware of, or, you can just have AI listen to your call and present answers to you. And this person was locked in, like there was no eye wandering or eye focus off screen. And they did a great job. I was like, I'd love to hire that person if they weren't
But
trying
it's
to
not
commit fraud
them.
to our company. Yeah,
It's
so
not
we got
them.
way in the process. We got way in the process, and we learned a lot of lessons. And so now it's like, hey, we have to be able to do some level of identity verification early in the process. And so, okay, well, what can you legally do? Right. So can you hold up your license to the screen so I can see you've got you might fake that license, but there's friction. If you physically have to hold up something that has your picture on it that looks like an ID, that's friction. And if folks know that friction is going to occur, they're probably less interested in engaging in fraudulent opportunities because they know the likelihood of being caught is probably higher. They'll look for better targets than companies like ours.
Got it. Got it. Let's shift gears here and talk a little bit about the good or positive side of AI, not the weaponized side. Tell me a little bit about how AI has changed your day to day as an engineering leader.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're what 3 or so years into this journey. I think everybody is. The appreciation I have is you can see the Gen AI space being more for a technical audience, especially early on. Our founder, CEO Howard Brown, has been all over AI since super early days. And so there's been a massive push over the course of 3 years to inundate not just our platform and what customers experience, but our resources with knowledge and acumen around generative tooling. So it's been a first class concern of our company. So where sometimes you run into internal friction on, well, yeah, that tool's really not that important. We still got to continue to do things the way we've been doing them because it's a known entity. He's been much more pushing us to push the bounds of what we can do within our platform and our products, and also with our own, personal acumen on how we can leverage it for more efficiency. Because I talked about the capital efficiency side of it. Well, a smart, savvy leader like Howard looks at this and says, well, we should be able to get more productivity of the people we have, even at the level that we're at today. And so we've been able to squeeze more productivity out of people because of the push to adopt generative tooling. So I would say not just for me, but for everybody across our organization, like it is inundated in terms of tooling access within revenue IO, but also just expectation on tooling acumen. So, we have access to essentially every tool, and we leverage a lot of tools within the product engineering space like everybody else. We've got it's kind of a soup du jour on whatever you choose for your AI copilot or, agentic tooling. So we've got Devin, we've got Cursor, we've got Claude, we've got Copilot, like we've got all the tooling. Codex, we're starting to monkey around with as well. Now Google's releasing its own coding tool, its own ID experience. So heavily involved on that side of it. But again, I think it's the culture of this company, I think has really allowed that to occur.
Yeah, and we've been running this podcast for a while now, and I remember that maybe a year ago, people were still talking about the challenges of adoption. It seems that that challenge has been overcome, and people are they're no longer struggling with the idea of hey, I need my guys or my teams to start using this. I think a lot of the conversation is now shifting into how do I measure the ROI of these things? Because you're mentioning, a series of tools that, and that cost adds up. How are you thinking about that? How do you guys think about ROI?
For us, it's velocity. It's essentially velocity, and kind of measuring opportunity costs of getting features to market more quickly. That's how we think about the ROI and investment. So we do focus a lot on looking at just pure velocity, and velocity is contributions really two-dimensional for the developer side, right? It's the I can do more because I've got co-piloting tools that make my development faster. That's kind of like, first generation. And then there's obviously the move to agentic tooling. How can I create inputs, constructs that I can feed into agentic workflow where I can add capacity that's separate than me. So I'm 1.5 resource, or maybe I'm 1.5 with generative AI by myself, and now I'm 2 because I've got kind of like an associate engineer doing low level tasks that I check in on, but I'm also contributing my own work, and I'm getting kind of 2 FTE out of a single FTE. And so we really focus a ton on tracking velocity on a per engineering basis, not to set up a competition, but to understand, like, if some folks are really getting improved velocity, what are they doing, and how can we extract those learnings and share those learnings with others on the team? Maybe they're finding by writing specific Claude MD files, they're getting way more productivity out of agentic workflows than folks who maybe are less familiar with it, right? And so it's a real opportunity to collaborate and share best practices, but you have to have some measure of which to identify some of those things sometime. And so we definitely focus on velocity, and the indexes on opportunity cost of getting features to market.
Do you think there are companies out there that are maybe looking at this wrong? I mean, are engineering leaders getting what are they getting wrong in rolling out AI to their teams?
Oh, great question. I think in general, it's the expectation. If I just tell you, if I dictate, you need to use generative AI, and I expect you to be better, without help, creating a culture of continuous learning and collaboration and sharing. I think that's a huge challenge. And I think everybody probably at one point falls victim to, well, you should just use the tooling and you should be better with, with the tooling because there it is. But I think, there's a curve. I mean, it's pretty well known that the learning curve with, generative integration into a developer workflow, it's a pretty steep adoption curve, and then it levels out. But there's friction, like there's entry friction into that experience, and you have to be reinforcing of the need to focus on it, prioritize it, create space for it. So engineers can work through kind of that dissonance that occurs at the beginning of the learning process to get through that inflection point. Because I think once developers get to the inflection point, then they're like, okay, now I understand how this stuff works. It doesn't solve every problem, but I know how to work with the tooling. I know that it's an iterative process, how I structure prompts and provide context, and what types of workloads I can give it, and where it can be successful, and it will continually get better, and it's continuously learning. But to get to that point requires some upfront investment. And I think you've got to create space and reinforce the priority of getting a high acumen in that space. And some folks just say, I expect you to deliver X amount of points per sprint, and that cannot change. I'm not creating any more space, but I expect you also to be learning all this generative tooling at the same time. Like, if you're trying to follow a commitment methodology, that's really difficult to do. Then it falls on these engineers to do all that work outside of work. And for some, they're all in. For some, they've got family, kids, commitments that they can't do it. So, how do you meet them where they need to be met so they can be successful in their generative journey? I think is a miss that some leaders have. And I probably missed on that at the beginning as well, until I started using the tools myself and was like, wow, this stuff isn't like, you learn it takes an hour and all of a sudden I'm very productive with the tooling. It takes effort. And so we got to create space for that effort.
Yeah, I totally get it. I think another engineering leader described it as the fallacy of the human-like interface. So the fact that it's conversational and it feels like it's a human raises expectations to a point where they're just not there, right? And if you're working with such high expectations, you're less productive than if you understand where the tool is able to deliver and where it's not able to deliver, and then you can really leverage your own productivity by knowing how to interact with it. So it's really, but you have to spend time with it. I think that's your point, right? You need the exposure, you need the space to experiment for that. I think it makes a ton of sense.
And I think what just turns out engineering's way of working, like, it's very disruptive. And I think I read in some podcasts, it was probably, 8 months ago, where engineers were the slowest to adopt, right, of all the roles within an organization, because I think way of working, it's a deterministic process, right? I'm trying to create an outcome. Code is fairly deterministic, and so there was much more criticality, I think, with an engineer to say, like, oh, that code's not written how I would want it to be written. Much more, and the technical acumen obviously exists with the engineer to be more critical of the outcomes because it's code. But I think we've overcome that from a large extent. People realize it's also an extinction event for engineering. Like all of my engineers are trying to move up stack to like, well, wow, I should be using vibe coding tools, and trying to be more of a front end developer so I can own the end to end development experience and not just a piece of it. Um, and we've got people learning, creating brand new services and brand new languages they've never touched before in a matter of days. They're production quality. That's the new expectation. And it's possible today where it wasn't, a year ago, probably.
Yeah, I think the deterministic nature of code and the deterministic nature of the problem solving aspect of code is really what made the adoption a little bit slower. I mean, a poem can't be wrong, right? It can be better or
Right,
worse, but
exactly.
it's not wrong, right? But code can. So yeah,
Yes.
it's really interesting to see how humans interact with non-deterministic systems in general. Derek, I wanted to shift gears here and move to our last section, talk a little bit about leadership skills and what it means to be a leader for you. And look, engineering leaders are facing a lot of change. I mean, AI, remote work, economic turbulence. Have you had to adjust your leadership style at all through all of this?
Uh, That's a good question. For me, I think being a little empathetic to we talked about that just here previously. I think there's a little bit of empathy you have to have in terms of not just within the four walls of your workday, but the macro changes that are happening and how influential that can be in kind of how people show up to work. And so I think there's more of an empathetic component to leadership maybe than there traditionally has been. The generative transition's scary for a lot of engineers. I think, will I be, and a lot of people talk about the new generation of engineer, right? Where they don't have X amount of years having to debug things and spend a night trying to fix that one problem. And there's a massive amount of learning that occurs in that space. It's formative, right? And you can shortcut that now, right? You can just shortcut all those formative experiences. And so I think there's a high level of fear, uncertainty, and doubt in the engineering space in general in terms of longevity of the role. So I think empathy is a critical component to it. And then we talked about it earlier, like a service orientation to leadership, I think is as important as it ever has been. So how do I support people in their during this process, this macro situation, but also with this generative transformation? How can I serve my engineers and be there for them and model the behavior and show the exuberance, the excitement around the transition versus the fear, uncertainty, and doubt? And so leading from the front, I think, is even more critical today.
Yeah, and it's happening. I think we're seeing more and more engineering leaders and CTOs getting closer to the tasks. Sometimes I mean, you have to experiment with the tooling to, cut through the hype, to model behavior. It's not about being the smartest person in the room. It's really like showing that this is a change everyone's going through together, right? So that's I think the leading from the front is really important in times of change, like the ones we're living in. And on that note, if someone's thinking right now about moving into a leadership role, which I know is the case with a lot of our viewers, what advice would you give to that person?
I think the two things I mentioned, I think, are pretty critical. Most organizations, when I promoted folks into leadership roles, it's mostly been because that they model a specific behavior that we find is critical to the success that our leaders have demonstrated. So, for us, it's that curiosity, and leading from the front in terms of being hyper curious in areas and being a change agent, especially as there's opportunities to lead areas of like agentic development or pick your landscape, right? I think there's an opportunity to demonstrate leadership in brand new areas that are emerging. I think for anybody who's an emerging leader who wants to take that on, I think there's a people component that will always exist, but I think there's also the new expectation of any hiring is you've got thought leadership in this generative world. And so I think finding an area where you can demonstrate thought leadership that you have a passion for, obviously, it can't be artificial. Like we have real passion for something and you can be a thought leader and shape a point of view for your organization. I think that's highly valued now because I think every organization is trying to figure out the landscape of generative is massive. Like where should I step and where should I not step and where should I invest and where should I not invest? And so I think having a point of view on that area is going to be critical for really any leadership hire. I mean, if you look at the JDs that exist out there today for leaders, I've not seen one that hasn't had some generative expectation in terms of thought leadership in it. It has all the check boxes around, people leadership and experience and all that basic stuff. But I think the real new kind of dimension of a job expectation as a leader is generative thought leadership. And so it's fun, it's exploratory, it's a new world, but you got to have that. And so pick your area that you've got passion on and become a thought leader in that space. And I think that sets you up really well to be hired into leadership roles and to excel in those roles.
I agree with that, and I think that that evidence of thought leadership is a proxy variable for somebody who just doesn't have only the managerial skills required to manage a team, but can actually stretch that team and motivate them beyond business as usual. I hadn't paid attention to that being part of the JDs for leadership positions recently, but that's a really good point. Last question, Derek. If you had to share a contrarian take that you have, I mean, something that most of your peers would disagree with, that's not really considered best practice, but you truly believe in, what would that be?
A contrarian take. I don't think it's contrarian, but it's the best I could do. I would say I have indexed a lot, and I've had lots of conversations with CTOs in various organizations that I'm probably over-indexed in is AI is an extinction event. And I think that's not just for roles like developers, et cetera, but for organizations. And so I've seen a lot of companies I've talked to that are like, and customers, right, are like, yeah, we're kind of dipping our toe, but we think we've got, plenty of runway ahead of us. We don't need to be thinking, transformationally in terms of generative. And I think I've raised a lot of eyebrows on that statement where this is an extinction event. And if you don't adjust quickly to the extinction event, you'll struggle to be successful or to be relevant in this world. And I had this conversation with my wife, who's a teacher, a lot. She actually teaches teachers about what we do with our children, right? And these kids are faced with a really challenging world they're going to walk into. And we're at this difficult situation where we're at this transition point, this transient state between the way the world used to work and the way it probably will steady state in a generative world or an AI world. And these kids are having to go through that transformational curve, and what success looks like and what skills you need to have and what a job in X industry and Y role looks like. Nobody knows what it's going to look like in the next 12 months. And so like the push on becoming really kind of native with just generative engagement it's off the charts. And I press my engineers all the time on that, which is why I lead from the front heavily on that expectation, because I want them to be very successful after they leave our company, which I'm sure their journeys will take them outside of Revenue.io at some point. And I want to make sure they're set up for success. So my level of urgency on that is probably greater than a lot. So probably the annoyance of some of my people, but I want to make sure, again, they're set up for success. And I think I'd rather index and be wrong than not index and be left out in the dust. And I feel the same way for my people. So I don't know if that's contrarian, but I would guess on the spectrum of urgency, I am probably a 1 to 10. I'm probably a 15 right now. And so I push really, really hard on it being a real extinction event. Probably the first one we've ever faced in modern society in terms of an intellectual extinction event. So it's one we have to quickly adjust to.
Super interesting. I love that. Derek, how can our listeners follow you? Are you on X, Twitter, LinkedIn?
I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. So I would say find me on LinkedIn, DS Knudsen, easy to find. Yeah, love to reach out and talk more on these topics too. I love this stuff. Don't hesitate to reach out. Always always interested in engaging in these types of conversations. So definitely hit me up on that.
All right. Thank you so much. This was great. I really loved it.
Thanks, Lucas.
All right. That was Derek Knudsen, Chief Delivery Officer and Head of Engineering at Revenue.io. If you found this helpful, follow Tech Teams today, wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a rating or comment with your favorite takeaway. Check with another engineering leader who would get value from it. Tech Teams Today is brought to you by Revello. We help U.S. companies find, hire, and pay full-time engineers based in Latin America. They're vetted, time zone aligned, and ready to start shipping code. I'm Lucas Mendez, CEO and founder of Revello. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.